Today, we're familiar with the options that we have available: 35mm, 120, large format 4x5, 8x10, and so on. But unfortunately for us film photographers, not all film formats made it out alive. So today on Overexposed, we're going to take a journey through the wild world of dead film formats. So let's get started. So the first film that I want to talk about was introduced by Kodak in 1982, and that was the Kodak film disc. This is one of the most distinct and weird film formats that you're ever going to see. It's most notable because it's a cartridge-based film. Kodak designed this film to be really simple and really easy to use, so therefore it was primarily marketed to casual photographers. The Kodak film disc was a circular disc inside of a plastic cartridge. It could be inserted into the camera for a total of 15 shots. So on that disc, there were 15 exposures around the circumference of the plastic disc. As you would press the shutter on the camera, it would rotate the disc around to the next frame. The only problem with the Kodak film disc was it was never really cheaper than any of the other formats available, and also the limited image quality, with the actual negative size of the images around the outside of the film disc only being 8 by 10.5 millimeters. These were very small negatives, and all the usual problems with small format films apply here. You're going to be looking at limited image quality, low resolution images, and that's okay if it's primarily a casual format, but there were a couple of problems with the Kodak film disc which actually led to its discontinuation. The first problem being cost. It really didn't offer any cost savings or any of the other film format options available at the time. And it was a brand new film format introduced in 1982, and the usual problems that apply with introducing a new film format applied here. There's a lack of install base. So you're creating a new film format and you're hoping camera manufacturers jump on board, design a bunch of cameras, and the film takes off. Unfortunately, this didn't happen, which also led to film manufacturers not jumping on board. So anybody who tried to shoot the Kodak film disc would have found very quickly that there weren't very many options available in terms of film speed or color. And it was those problems that ultimately led to the discontinuation of the Kodak film disc in the 1990s. Another problem with the Kodak film disc was the advancement with 35mm point-and-shoot cameras. Most of the cameras that were designed to shoot the Kodak film disc were casual point-and-shoot style cameras without many manual controls or any professional features like that. And over the next few years, many of those professional options would actually trickle down into point-and-shoots. So there wasn't really a great value proposition with the Kodak film disc. You can get many of the features that you want from a casual point-and-shoot style camera with a 35mm option, get more exposures on a roll, and the film's going to be cheaper. So it's easy to see why, by the 1990s, that the Kodak film disc was discontinued. Although it is a really cool, really sweet 1980s relic. The next film format that I had to talk about is 620 film. And 620 film is interesting because of how similar it is to 120 film. Kodak introduced the 620 format in 1932, and they primarily introduced it as a replacement to 120 film. And unfortunately, over the years, it would just basically exist alongside 120 film, and the film would ultimately be discontinued in the 1990s as well. Unfortunately, that's going to be a trend. But the thing that made 620 format film different from 120 format film is all in the spool. The spool was much smaller than 120 format film. Another weird cartridge-based format introduced by Kodak was the 126 film. This was also known as the Instamatic film, and unlike the film disc, this was actually a popular cartridge-based film format introduced by Kodak in 1963. And many advantages that Kodak had sought to bring to market with the Kodak film disc were present in the 126 format as well. This was primarily marketed again at casual shooters. Just like the film disc, Kodak hoped that by introducing it as a cartridge-based format, it would make loading and unloading film very simple without the risk of light leaks or dust getting in the film. And unlike the Kodak film disc, the actual negative size for 126 film was actually much larger. These were 28 by 28mm squares. And all throughout the 60s and the 70s, Instamatic cameras continued to gain popularity. 126 format films came in a variety of sizes and film speeds. As there were many cameras that found their way to the market, film manufacturers were quick to jump on board and make all of their popular film formats and choices in the Instamatic 126 format. And once again, this film was discontinued by Kodak in the 1990s. And at this point in time, it's really hard to find unopened 126 format film. Another interesting film format that's no longer with us is Minox film. This was a specialized film format made to be used exclusively in Minox cameras. And as we go along, I'll show you a few Minox cameras so you can get an idea of what this was used in. The Minox cameras were obviously sub-miniature cameras designed and manufactured by the Minox company. The Minox cameras, if you couldn't tell by the name of their company, were designed to be small and compact and really easy to use. And these cameras were really popular in the 20th century, but mainly during the 50s and the 60s. Much like the Kodak film disc and the 126 format before, this was also a cartridge-based format, and the negatives were really small in this as well, being only 9.2 millimeters. One thing that was really cool about these Minox cartridges though is there were lots of different cameras that were introduced that shot all different formats. Sometimes the images would be rectangular and be 8x11, sometimes they'd be 8x8 in a square, or they would be 9x14 millimeters. Different cameras shot different formats, so that was really cool. But that would also dictate how many exposures you'd get on a roll, so these weren't uniform either. One thing that was cool about Minox film though is you always got lots of exposures. So some cameras would get 30 exposures on a cartridge, some cameras would get 50 exposures on a cartridge, but either way you're getting lots of exposures, so not having to change film all that much. Although the company Minox still exists, they no longer make cameras. Now they manufacture sports equipment, optics, those kinds of things. And they no longer make any of this film, but a quick look around the web showed that the film photography project, at least rather recently, were respooling some Minox film for these small cameras. So if you're lucky, cross your fingers, maybe you can get to try shooting some of this. And another film format, and this one a lot more recent, is the APS format. Kodak APS was the advanced photo system, and this was Kodak Fuji's attempt to bring film photography into the 21st century. The film was introduced in 1996 and continued to gain popularity through the 90s and into the 2000s. The film was developed and marketed as an improvement over 35mm film at the time. They primarily designed this film with the idea that they would bring more convenience to casual film shooters. Much like many of the other weird formats that we've talked about on this video, the APS format was also a cartridge-based system. And again, the idea there is that it's easier to load and unload than traditional 35mm or other film formats. When APS was introduced, it was introduced with 3 print formats, and users could select the print format that they want: classic, high definition, or panchromatic. Classic had an aspect ratio of 3:2, or similar to traditional 35mm. High definition had an aspect ratio of 4:3, and then panchromatic had a traditional wide aspect ratio. One of the most innovative features of APS film was that it had a magnetic coating on the back of the film, which allowed the camera to actually record information about the shot, such as time, date, those kinds of things, actually embedded into the back of the image. But perhaps the most innovative feature, and the feature that most folks remember the most about APS film, is that it was also this this information on the back of the film that allowed the users to rewind or advance the film to a specific exposure, which allowed for a roll of APS film to be ejected from the camera, a new roll put in, and then the previous roll to be reinserted later and picked back up at the appropriate frame. Many of us are familiar with the traditional film workflow of, oh crap, I'm at 25 exposures, I better shoot the rest of these shots or I'm never going to get them shot. And while the film was initially popular, this film format had the unfortunate reality of being introduced near the onset of digital photography. So it's unclear if APS, it was any real problem with APS, or it was just digital photography that ended up wiping it out. But either way, APS was discontinued in the 2000s. And another film format is 127 film. Not the greatest at naming their films, they just threw some numbers together and hoped it worked out. But 127 format film, despite being one number farther than 126 film that we talked about, was actually introduced much earlier in 1912. This film was primarily designed to be used in compact cameras. 127 film was roll film, unlike many of the cartridge-based films we've been talking about for a while, but the images on the negatives were actually 4cm by 4cm squares. So a little larger format images than what we've been dealing with many of the formats on this list, but again, you're kind of locked into that square format. This film, although it was introduced in 1912, the film really took off and gained popularity during the 30s and the 40s. It was really easy to load, unload, and made for a really easy, convenient shooting experience. And Kodak introduced many cameras, compact cameras primarily, that were made to use this film, and it was because of those advantages, this was a format that was really widely adopted by the masses. But just like many of the other formats on this list, by the 1990s, Kodak 127 film would be discontinued as well. So that's my list of interesting dead film formats that are no longer with us. And if you thought this video was cool, take a look at this video about the most interesting discontinued film of all time, and that's Kodachrome. But as always guys, thank you so much for watching, and if you like this video, please subscribe. We'll see you later.